Welcome once again, everyone, to the Mindful Public Safety Hour. It's my distinct pleasure this evening and my honor to introduce our presenter for the evening, James Chapman, the inaugural Executive Director of the CIT Coalition in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He brings 29 years of law enforcement experience with the Roanoke County Police Department, where he retired as Assistant Chief. A graduate of the FBI National Academy, Chapman holds degrees from SUNY Brockport and Northeastern University and is committed to advancing CIT initiatives across Virginia. Welcome, Jimmy.
Thanks, Robert, for the introduction, and John and Robert both. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here tonight and to discuss this unique intersection of CIT training and mindfulness. There's a cost in the work that our first responders do that doesn't really show up in incident reports. It's the accumulation of pressure and trauma and stress that in some ways becomes a spiral for many first responders that they fall into. And I'm so sorry about that. CIT was designed to improve outcomes for people in crisis. But what we've come to learn is that CIT, mindfulness, and other type of protective factors together improve the outcomes for responders as well. And so that's really what my discussion is going to focus on. I would like to talk about just, or at least give everyone somewhat of a high-level overview of what I'd like to discuss today. And so I would like to take an opportunity to just discuss the Virginia CIT Coalition, to give a brief history of CIT training, as well as I have found over the years that at my time with the police department that I would often be asked to come and speak to the CIT classes to give an overview of the executives, reasons executives might think that CIT is relevant and important for the department and for officers to experience. And so I would do that. And what I found is that would only take me about 15 minutes. And the trouble was they gave me a whole hour to talk, so I always wanted to have something else to lean on. And I felt that wellness was something that we could introduce to. Was a great place to introduce this idea of wellness. We're in a space that we're talking about mental illness, mental health, feelings, emotions, empathy, compassion. It's like, well, this seems like a great place to open up a conversation about wellness. And so what I'll weave into that conversation around wellness is some information from the Public Safety Wellness Survey, talk a little bit about the trauma spiral, as well as to finish up on resiliency as the protective factors. So going ahead and moving forward to give you just a little bit of history here about the Virginia CIT Coalition is, our organization was established in 2009. And the coalition is a nonprofit organization that unites all crisis intervention teams across the Commonwealth of Virginia. The coalition accomplishes mission through facilitating collaboration, supporting training, and advancing advocacy efforts. And I would be absolutely remiss if I did not acknowledge all of the hard work that the coalition, the volunteers of the coalition, had put in to create this organization. We were established in 2009, but it was not as a nonprofit. CIT had launched in the mid to late 90s in Virginia, and it actually started just about 45 minutes down the road from me in the New River Valley. And it grew from that point on throughout the Commonwealth, and it was a slow, progressive growth. And so as CIT programs were building across the Commonwealth, each program has a local coordinator. And those local coordinators were looking for help, best practices, and then you'd have another local community wanting to bring CIT in, and they were reaching out to these other coordinators and saying, how do I do this? And so from that, literally from a grassroots effort, this coalition was born. And from 2009 moving forward, they started to get quite a bit of recognition within the state of all of the very good work that they were doing that subsequently gained attention of the Youngkin administration and subsequently helped fund the coalition to professionalize as well as to develop and build out and to further advance de-escalation training in the state. And we have been on that mission since receiving that funding. And that's also what landed me into this position. A little bit further about the coalition, that we do have collaboration, as I stated, across the Commonwealth. A couple of things that we're really proud of is our model lesson plans. Earlier this year, we had launched into 2 different model lesson plans. Our first was the one that covers the basic 40-hour CIT training, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail after this slide. But that model lesson plan was vetted by our state agency, the Department of Criminal Justice Services, and that allows for all of our CIT trainings across the Commonwealth, which we have 38 different programs, to train the exact same content. And the beauty of that is that it does allow for local programs to submit their own content as well. So our program is 31 hours. The remaining 9 hours of that 40-hour week can include any local content that's relevant. And what we're seeing is that many of those programs are choosing to introduce material and training around officer wellness. We also have a public safety telecommunications course, which we launched earlier this year, which directly supports our 911 operators. That 8-hour course also blends in a recent development in the state, which is the Marcus Alert program, or more commonly referred to as a co-responder program. But as you know, the first line is our communication officers who take the call from an individual, or from an individual who's experienced a crisis, or maybe a loved one or family member or bystander who's observing something unusual or suspicious, or needs to report. And so our communication officers then basically triage those calls and try to determine if it could be diverted to a 988 helpline, or does it require a police officer and a mental health professional response? And so this public safety telecommunications course directly supports that. We also provide some other trainings, and we also put on an annual conference where we really love to take an opportunity to showcase the great work that's happening across the Commonwealth. And we have 9 different categories of awards, which we also issue. And much of CIT, as you will soon learn, is built on this idea of partnerships. And so we must maintain and we do have very strong cross-system partnerships within the Commonwealth. Just briefly, a little bit of history. As Robert indicated, you're familiar with it. I'm not sure how familiar everyone else is on the call, but we'll just dive into the history just briefly. This actually dates back, at this point, we're almost 40 years. 1987, the Memphis Police Department had a lethal shooting with a 27-year-old male who was suicidal and had a history of severe mental illness. And the community outrage and the police department recognized the need to do something differently as it relates to officers responding to crisis events. And so they reached out to their local NAMI, as well as Memphis University and the University of Tennessee. And what the goal is to develop a more intelligent, understandable, and safe approach to mental health crisis events. And that spawned off what's more commonly referred to today as the Memphis model. And best estimates is that there's over 2,700 of these CIT programs in communities in the United States, and as well as internationally. A few of the critical outcomes that we think about when with this training is that we want to ensure safety happens during the crisis events, and it's there to protect all parties involved. And one of the big things I always like to focus on in this training is, in much in my earlier years in the profession, CIT took on the label of being the warm fuzzy training, and quite honestly, it's not that. And what I would often challenge our classes with is that, you can display empathy and also be tactically cognitive. And so two things can be true at once. And so if we combine those things, we can think about it as tactical empathy, but we can use compassion and humanize individuals that are going through a mental health crisis. It also equips responders to support individuals in crisis, trying to find those individualized solutions, and to try to work to make the most appropriate outcomes, trying to connect individuals to the necessary services, so diverting individuals away from arrest when appropriately to some other mental health support system. It enhances listening skills and de-escalation skills. This is a big component of CIT. When I think about my own experience and going through CIT in the mid to late 90s, I really took quite a bit out of the training, and it really came as, and to this day I still say, as a patrol officer, it was one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable training that I had been involved in. And I found myself in 1995 coming down to Roanoke, Virginia, from a small town in upstate New York, and entering the police academy. 16 weeks later, I find myself in the patrol car with a field training officer, and that lasted for another 12 weeks. I had probably about 4 hours of mental health training total. And then my very first handful of calls that I go to, persons are certainly in crisis states. One of the very first ones was a gentleman who had suicide ideations, and I muddled my way through that call. And from that point on for the next couple of years, I found myself going to those calls more and more frequently, and recognizing that I felt very ill prepared to handle some of those calls and the best way forward. And then there was this other section of calls, or types of calls that I would respond to, that involved very serious mental illness, and might show up as in some types of ways maybe schizophrenic or highly delusional. And in those calls, I found myself to be super curious about. And then came CIT into my world, and what I realized from taking that training was, it definitely increased my knowledge and skills around communication, but also increased my knowledge just around mental health and mental illness. Really understanding what questions to ask, how to ask those questions, understanding about foundational, understanding of psychotropic medicine and how that sometimes has adverse effects, and that can cause people to not take their medicine, subsequently leading to other behavioral problems. So it really helped to build and to humanize individuals that were going through crisis. And I found it to be one of the most valuable trainings. And I love to say that it literally puts a tool on officers' tool belts that they can take from the classroom and go immediately out into the field and apply. So those are our critical outcomes. Let's look at some of the benefits that we have from CIT as well. And so, first off is that since this program has been around, or this training has been around since the late 80s, there's been ample opportunity for academia to take a look at the effectiveness and any efficacy that comes from this training. And the one thing that we can lean on when we think about if it's evidence-based, this is a very popular term in law enforcement and many professions today, is what's the research telling us, and are we doing the best practices? And what we know about one of the benefits of CIT is that it absolutely improves attitudes, officers' attitudes as it relates to individuals who are in crisis, as well as it increases their knowledge around mental illness. Very similar to the experience that I had. And enhances public safety. It helps officers when they were responding, and they can respond more effectively to mental health crisis by reducing the risk of escalation and any potential harm that could happen to the individual in crisis. It promotes the use of de-escalation skills and trying to minimize using force as well. and trying to avoid those unnecessary confrontations. And with that, it leads us right into improved officer safety. Officers who undergo CIT training are better prepared to identify signs of mental illness, to understanding the behavior of individuals who are in crisis, and then respond appropriately. So this training helps reduce the risk of injury to both officers and individuals as they encounter. And all of this sometimes, and where we can lead this to is community trust and community collaborations. And so in some of our communities across the Commonwealth, and I'm sure this happens in jurisdictions where you live as well, is that when someone's calling 911 to get an officer to respond to a crisis situation, that CIT is now embedded in the community, and they're actually asking for CIT officers. Or CIT officers will wear a pin on their uniform, and that pin is an indication to the person like, hey, I've had some specialized training in this area, and people recognize that and trust that they're going to get a slightly different perspective, or maybe get they may get their needs met in some way. So that's one of the aspects that we really see from a community trust building. It also, it builds trust amongst the mental health professionals since they're working very closely with law enforcement agencies as well. CIT training from its inception was built on this idea that law enforcement and behavioral health professionals will teach this content. And that's the way it's done. It has been done ever since. And that local collaboration of local law enforcement, local behavioral health professionals working together, training together, helps build that trust and collaboration. Of course, there's some reduction in the reliance on the criminal justice system as well. Anytime that we can divert a person to treatment versus arrest or some other aspect in the criminal justice system, it helps. And it helps reduce any of the strain on that particular section of the criminal justice system. I will just speak briefly on some projects that I was involved in when I was at Roanoke County as the assistant chief. In 2016, I had an opportunity to work alongside George Mason University, a local mental health provider organization. Our organization had received significant funding from VGA, from the Smart Policing Initiative, to launch a randomized control trial to evaluate essentially what was a co-responder model. And what we learned from that, among several things, but one of the key takeaways from that particular project was that if you could divert an individual, so if you let me back up for a moment, if you have an individual who is a high utilizer, someone who's frequently calling 911 for police services or fire and EMS services, and you could connect that individual to treatment, and then keep them in treatment for a short period of time, the recidivism or repeat calls to 911 actually went down from those individuals. So really, this is a great opportunity where we're seeing today across the United States and internationally this uprising of police and behavioral health professionals responding to calls collectively, and the behavioral health professionals being able to provide treatment. And now once we have the treatment options in place, if we can get a case manager attached to that person, the likelihood of their recidivism starts to go down or starts to depreciate a little bit. So there is some significant value there. When you think about CIT, and we talk about what type of training this is, I also think about, personal and professional growth. And certainly from, the professional side, it's going to enhance the officer's knowledge and skills as they go and do their work. It promotes empathy and communication, and it certainly promotes problem-solving abilities. All of those things being very good for our professional life. I would also say that, at least for me personally, I need to work on this, despite the fact that I'm the CIT executive director and have gone through the training, is that empathy in conversations are very important. With my significant other and my son, to have those conversations and at times have to display empathy. And so that's one of the things that I see also as a benefit from putting officers through CIT, is that there is this professional benefit, but there's also a personal gain that comes from it as well. And we could argue about the best practices as well. I would argue that by agencies embracing a CIT, it aligns the department with some of the best standards. It demonstrates a commitment to excellence, and that they are aimed to improve interactions with individuals who are in crisis, as well as building great partnerships with their local behavioral health professionals. So at this point in the conversation is where I sort of end any kind of stop or pause, at least on the CIT heavy conversations, and I'd like to move us in a direction of wellness. And with that being said, one of the parts I would like to talk about here is to start as use as the foundation of this conversation is the National Wellness Survey. And this National Wellness Survey for public safety personnel is a robust research-based effort to assess the impact of public safety work on individuals' well-being. And this survey actually includes questions that are about officers' exposure to various traumatic experiences, their personal and professional life stressors, as well as symptoms of well-being and any coping strategies. Important aspect of this data that I will share with you is that the period of time that this data was collected was November 2020 to November 2021. So in the peak of COVID, George Floyd, all of those things, as well as this during that time we saw a significant reduction in law enforcement staffing across the United States. Some agencies reporting anywhere from 20 to 40% reductions in staff due to retirements or officers deciding to transition and do something else. The data itself, though, is we look at it. We had the National Wellness Survey received 8,710 respondents. 165 agencies across 23 states and Washington, D.C. They broke the respondents down into basically three large buckets: sworn law enforcement officers, fire and rescue personnel, and dispatchers. And those the four sections as we talked about was, let's look at their exposure to trauma, stressors and stress management, get some demographics information, and then health and well-being. And so as you can see here, this is the percentage of survey respondents who reached clinically significant scores of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicide ideation. And other than in the law enforcement, under depression, all of the other categories are significantly higher than the national average. And, it always, as a former law enforcement officer and police executive, my agency experienced 2 officers during my career that had died by suicide. And, it tears apart the families and it tears apart the organization. And we know that officers are more likely to die by the means of their own gun than they are by a felonious attack. And so these numbers are staggering, and it really just sort of raises the question of why and what can we do. And we're very blessed to have quite a bit of emphasis being placed around the topic of wellness, officer safety, mental health in the policing, public safety space right now. It has been going on. It has been a trend that has been going on since I've seen it just gradually increase over the course of my career. But we've really seen like International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum, National Policing Institute doing wonderful work in this space, as well as a number of other outside vendors and subject matter experts who are out there doing their best to support law enforcement and other first responders to help reduce some of these numbers and get these scores down. And it leads me to that question of why. And so this is some research that I came across of that I really thought did a wonderful job of explaining some of the causal or potential, what are some of the things that actually impact officers' trauma that could lead to some of these behavioral health problems. And so this research goes back to 2013, and it's titled "The Police Complex Spiral Trauma," and it explains how officers accumulate stress and trauma over the course of their careers. It shows that police trauma is not usually one big event, although it could be, but it's more or less a spiraling buildup of stressors that interact with each other and essentially grow over time. I'm sure this might be a little bit of speaking to the choir, and I'm sorry, but as we can see, the officer here in the center is, faced with a tremendous amount of stressors that come into their world. The repeated exposure to violence, threats of violence to themselves, to other officers, to their family. They routinely, responding to calls for service that involve human suffering. We talked about a little bit from the survey results, some of the community scrutiny that was placed on officers back in 2021. Years and years and years of community conflict that officers are battling with and have to try to overcome year after year. And so those stressors are real, as well as the fact that we think about in today's modern policing that officers have in-car cameras, body-worn cameras, and everything that they do can be recorded, either by department-owned property or by a citizen on the street. And it just, really, it just makes you think about the amount of pressure that must carry with it to know that your every action is being recorded at some point in time. I had a friend of mine who was trying to work with a local police department and was a little frustrated over how the officers were handling the case, and he was reaching out to me, and he's a financial planner, and so I asked him. I said, how would you feel as if I sat in your office every day and leaned over your shoulder and told you which stocks to buy or which mutual funds to purchase? I said that's quite a bit of stress that happens. And so, let the officers give them some grace and give them a little bit of time to work in the timeline they have, but also understand that, they have some other things that are going on. And so there is some challenges there. There's definitely some challenges that officers face as they're dealing with the reality of their job. And sometimes it's not pretty. We often hear that the organizational pressures are much greater than the things that happen in the field. And so, paramilitary organization, lots of rules and regulations all play into all add to the stressors, as well as, living in this space of hypervigilance, always on high alert, that can cause fatigue, as well as, working extra shifts, working overtime duties to make ends meet. All of that can lead to strained relationships, extra stress, and trauma to the officers. Now, all of these things independently are totally manageable, but over years of a long career, they accumulate, they intensify, and and they create some physical they wear down officers. And what we see is that oftentimes it's just like an emotional shutdown. And so it's just essentially like, I don't want to have emotional conversations. I'm not really feeling, I'm numb. Let me just get through the shift and move on to something else. And this becomes a burden to the family and sometimes can cause some disconnections between the people that they love. And so this sort of spiral just it feeds itself and impacts it, and ultimately leading to, more significant disorders as I tried to illustrate previously from the survey, as well as what the research has brought forward as well. And so without support or wellness practices, the spiral continues downward. So ideally, what we want to move towards in the profession and personally is we want our officers to find ways to interrupt that spiral. And so how do we do that? And so there's several ways. And so first and foremost, like with anything, we got to recognize the warning signs, right? And so this can come across as emotional exhaustion, reduced patience on calls. So maybe one of your coworkers pulls you aside and, hey, what's going on? That's not you. You might find yourself on the hot seat in the supervisor's office more than you'd like, or maybe you're facing some disciplinary action. Or more than likely where it's showing up, is in those relationships that actually matter, and that officers are their significant others or friends or even close coworkers are saying you don't seem yourself. So it's recognizing those warning signs. And then building up those some psychological resilience, stress management skills, emotional regulation practices. And this is where mindfulness and meditation comes into play. And then, another big part of this is that purpose-driven identity outside and away from the badge. This one's really big. And it's just, in many professions, it's just very much to get absorbed with, I am a police officer, I'm just a cop. And in recognizing that we're so much more than that, that we're fathers and husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and all of that, but then, we're part of our community as well. So, maybe we're coaching, or maybe we're a gifted woodworker, or we're a painter or a photographer or whatever it may be, but there's an identity outside of the job. And finding that's really critical, and understanding that it does exist. Big focus is those protective factors as well. Let's focus on sleep hygiene, good nutrition, daily movement, making sure that we've got good relationships, both those that are in person as well as now we have to talk about our online relationships as well. And so, not getting caught up in all the X Twitter feeds and all of that chaos. Let's stay away from there and stay to the healthier side of social media if we choose to engage in it. And then also those professional supports. And so from an organization level, is really trying to find, really focusing in on our first line, middle managers, and upper management, focusing on each level of making sure that they're getting exceptional training. We're getting them the appropriate managerial and leadership training that's needed to provide that supportive leadership culture for our officers. Building out, these are very popular today, and many modern law enforcement is having peer support teams, and those officers who are specially trained and go around and have conversations with their peers to just check in, to see how they're doing. Wellness check-ins. This is something I was involved in right before I left my organization helped launch mandatory wellness checks with mental health professionals. So everyone from the chief to the newest person in the academy, we sent every year to go in and just talk with a clinician. And we don't care what you say. You can talk about the weather. You can talk about your most significant call that you want to get off your chest. Whatever it is, we're not going to know about it as the executives of the organization. We just want you to go and help to try to break down that stigma, and also to make it easier should the officer want to choose to continue to have a conversation, to make it easy to pick up the phone and talk with somebody and make that call. And then also, chaplain support. I was very blessed to have a wonderful chaplain, multiple chaplains in my organization that we leaned on very heavily for multiple events. So those are also very good. All of these serve as those interrupters to that spiral. And it also would challenge us to think about mindfulness, right? Going back to that physiological, getting some controls over our physiological and creating some physiological reset, which mindfulness absolutely does. And to avoid judging our feelings and thoughts and emotions, creating that cognitive clarity. So we're making good decisions on calls that are not driven by emotion. And I love this idea of the responding versus reacting, which in mindfulness and meditation really helps in that regard. So all of this, mindfulness is a critical component, I believe, to interrupting that trauma spiral by maintaining, helping officers maintain composure, help them think clearly while interacting with erratic individuals, generating a sense of calm. If we're on a traffic stop that's going slightly sideways, or someone wants to, be volatile towards the officer, it helps us generate a sense of calm, as well as it helps to increase our awareness to environments that we may perceive as unsafe. If you're a communications officer, the exact same thing is the maintaining clarity and being able to think clearly as you're trying to assess what type of response do I need to send for this individual. And then CIT also plays a role in this. And so CIT training helps also to interrupt that spiral. As we talked about, big component of CIT training is really learning to slow things down, de-escalate, use good communication skills, listen actively, show empathy, display empathy in your communication, while also maintaining safety. One of the other key components of CIT training is that it's built on scenarios. Officers are placed in progressively more difficult and challenging scenarios as the week progresses. And those scenarios serve as sort of like the practice environment for a pro football player, right? They go through multiple drills so that when they're on the field and they have to face they're going through a tackle, they can make a move or use that footwork that they've been practicing in the gym or out on the practice field. They can apply it in the real world environment, and that's exactly what CIT training does. You get an opportunity to go through the scenario yourself as well as observe your peers, and we can learn vicariously through that as well. CIT helps build that bridge between mental health professionals so that so we trust and have that trust in our professionals if we need to make a call, or that they also understand what we're going through when we're on these calls for service, and that they help guide they understand our decision and help guide the individual to the appropriate treatment. And then, as programs across the Commonwealth are introducing this idea of wellness into CIT, what that actually equals and reaffirms to officers is that wellness equals readiness for officers. And then lastly, I want to leave with just this idea of resiliency and its potential factor as well. And resilience is just the capacity to cope with stressors without significant negative disruptions in functioning. And what the literature speaks very strongly to here is its effect on mental health outcomes for officers. And so what we've seen is a reduction that reduces the impact of PTSD, although varying, but for most it leans heavily on reducing PTSD. Having good resiliency reduces perceived stress, emotional exhaustion, and burnout, and ultimately increasing motivation. And so all of these things, having good resiliency training and building resiliency in our officers, the practice in building out mindfulness, meditation type practices that officers can utilize either on or off duty, and then CIT, the training of training CIT. It's this intersection that I do believe has a positive impact on officers' performance and more importantly on their well-being. With that, I will turn it over for any questions.
Yeah, feel free to unmute if you have a question or put your question in chat, folks.
I have a question. I used to be a corrections officer, and then I got some heart issues, so I had to stop. But I want to still be involved, and then I'm starting my MSW classes again in September, but I have this time and I want to get involved, and I'm not sure how.
Absolutely. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to reach out to, depending on which jurisdiction you're in or close by, is to one of the local community service boards. They are responsible for all the public mental health in the Commonwealth. So they're divided up into different regions. If you would send me an email, I'd be more than happy to try to connect you with someone that's close by in your region.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Appreciate your interest.
I would like to just first thank you for your work and your presentation. It was great. I loved a few of the pieces. The one part about trying to divert criminals from the criminal justice system to treatment with a case manager, I thought was really rich. Just from your experience or your opinion, I'm just going to mention Jack Cornfield, who is a former monk and psychologist and a Buddhist teacher, of course, teaching mindfulness. And one statement he made quite a while ago, when he got his degree, his first position was in a mental institution. And he said prisons are sort of the default treatment instead of like mental institutions or care facilities. And he felt that there was a real shortage in that area, and that's why a lot of people end up incarcerated. What's your experience?
I would agree with that. I would totally agree with that. That is, and I think the data would support that, and that in many of our uh, larger institutions that are incarcerating individuals is that there's a high population that have mental health disorder. That's absolutely, I think that's absolutely true. And it does create a challenging situation, in the field because you have to make it, some of these events some calls that you're going to, the only option officers may have is arrest. But then once a person may get incarcerated, then we start to learn all of the other uh, there may be a whole diagnosis that comes with that individual. And so, yes, I would totally support that. I think our local sheriff would agree with me with that comment as well, is that there's a significantly large population that is currently incarcerated that has a mental illness.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jimmy, how does this training manifest itself in terms of the challenges of officer shortages? I know in Indianapolis, IMPD, the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, has something around a 500 officer shortage right now, and I actually did a ride along with them earlier this month, and just knowing that there was multiple calls, there was about 8 calls involving the officer that I was riding with during a 7-hour period, and multiple of those 8 calls involved mental illness. One of them took an hour and a half to resolve, and in this particular case, there wasn't any CIT officers available or responding. So I'm just trying to figure out how do you get at this complex issue of recruitment, retention, shortage of staff, and trying to get people in the classroom rather than in the field where they're obviously constantly needed and under stress on every shift.
Um, that's a real issue. And overall, when you look at mental health calls for service, the amount of time that they take is disproportionate to any other call for service that law enforcement is going to respond to. In my agency, in my former agency, average call would be between like 38 and 45 minutes is about the average any call. And you look at the mental health calls, over 4 hours was how much time officers were spending on that. I was just at American Society for Criminologists had their annual conference in DC, and I was there as a discussant. And one of the panel that I was discussing on, they had data there from a Northern Virginia police agency. Their average response time was 25 minutes on any call, and hour plus on anything mental health related. And that's a much larger agency than mine. So it's a real issue to your point. And it is challenging also. It's difficult when you're short-staffed to send officers to a 40-hour course and taking somebody off the road for a week and then have to backfill that in some way. And that's a real challenge. What we are seeing, there are alternatives to doing CIT, the formal CIT training. And so IACP has recently come out with their program, CRIT, which is only a 3-day course. The Police Executive Research Forum and National Police Institute have just created a crisis intervention course as well, which is only a 3-day course, 3-day course also. But these are real issues that agencies have to face. One of the ways that we dealt with this, and although it's somewhat controversial in the CIT world, is that we sent all of our new hires, we embedded CIT training into the academy, and we started that back in 2015. And there's, certainly there's a strong advocacy around that, you have to self-select, officers have to self-select, and they have to have a couple of years of experience prior to coming into the CIT training. I could argue for a whole nother hour on the reasons why I would challenge that thought. But the reality is that's the way our organization handled that. And so we just embedded it into the police academy. We included it right towards the end, so officers had, quite a bit of experience, at least in the classroom, and then could take this skill. As I said before, it's literally a tool in their toolbox. And so we're giving them more skills, more knowledge. It increases it, and to me, like that's sort of a path to mastery in the profession, but you got to start someplace. But the reality is that agencies across the United States with staffing right now is the way that it is. Keep pulling somebody to a 40-hour class is significant. And if you think about it, most police departments in the United States are less than 20 officers. So now imagine trying to take one patrol officer that might be working, a two-man shift for 12 hours, and one of them has to go to training for a week. It's a real problem. And I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer other than we put it in the basic academy. But it's a real issue, and agencies have to prioritize. Essentially, at the end of the day, leadership's got to make a decision on what the priority is. And do you run short? Do you backfill in some ways? Do you compel overtime to happen? There's a whole bunch of other, managerial things that can happen, but ultimately it's going to have to be a priority from the leadership inside the organization to say, no, this actually matters. It matters for our officers and it matters for our community.
Well, Jamie Chapman, I want to thank you so much for your presentation here. I've got a list of questions, but unfortunately we're here at our time. Just there was a lot of meat there, and Jimmy, keep doing what you're doing. Great work.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. Robert, thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate everyone's attention this evening and your interest in CIT. Thank you all very much. Appreciate the work that you're doing as well.
Great work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a great evening. Take care.
Be well, everyone. Good night.